All right, so on this generation of saws, 281s as well, they talk about using a piston stop, and it's these metal style stops. You can use those. There's also some nylon type stops that might be kinder to the piston. Generally speaking, I don't have an issue with the pistons, but theoretically, if you have too much pressure, if you can't get the clutch or the flywheel off because it's just seized too tight, and as this comes up against the top of the piston, theoretically it could crack or punch a hole in the piston. I've never had that happen. Since I'm taking this off, I'm already going to be taking the top end off anyway, so it's not a big deal. But basically what you do here, I've got the decomp in. Screw this in. I'm not quite at top dead center yet, but I'm going to be. So I just get that all the way down, not overly tight or anything, and then move the flywheel till it stops. So now it's up on the piston. So now I can get in here and take this off, and we're going to start by using our 4mm Allens and just taking these pawls off. I have noticed ever so slight damage to these pawls right here, and it's coming pretty close to the nut. It is installed correctly, but I'm guessing that the person that took the flywheel off in the past, so it's probably been off at least once, may have damaged these, kept these on when they tried to take off the flywheel nut. Well, I always like to take these off. Again, don't forget you need to manage all of this, keep track of all your parts before they get mixed up and so forth. I like to use small baggies, put a little label on them or a permanent marker, mainly for generic bolts so that I know where they go, so I don't have to spend too much time tracking things down. So the way this goes together is you've got a washer on just the far end. It comes up against the spring here. You got the pawl and then the bolt. But it's not hard to figure out how to put these together so that you got them on correctly. So we got that done. And then I think we're going to be looking at probably the same as the 281, 288s. I'm guessing a 14 mil. Yeah, that might be a little. Yeah, it's a 13. So now that I have the piston stop on here, makes it pretty easy to. And I don't have the handle off yet, obviously. Well, this was really on there. May end up needing to take the handle off. You shouldn't have to have that nut on there quite so tight. This was done with, obviously it was done without a benefit of a torque wrench. The other problem I see is there is a washer on there. It's like it's corroded a little bit, so a lot of stuff's gotten on this saw. It hasn't been well taken care of. It does have this one is a flat washer, it looks like. At least on the 288s, 281s, they've got a concave washer and kind of spring-loaded, almost kind of a locking washer. I'll have to look at the parts list on this, verify that this doesn't take that. If it does, and I may be ordering or finding an aftermarket equivalent. And maybe you can tell here, but there's a little bit of corrosion around that. It's not bad though, it's not terrible, and the threads look okay. So we're probably going to be all right, but I am expecting a little bit of some force necessary to pop that off. But we're done. We don't need this piston stop anymore. All right, a really quick addendum. the muffler situation. Got all my muffler bolts and bits here bagged up. I was able to get this muffler bolt right here off, and it wasn't hard. Yeah, you just got to be careful. So the other previous owner probably wasn't all that careful. One of the things though that you may have noticed with the old muffler, the way it came, it had gotten smashed here. So I did notice that the bolt on this side had a very slight bend in it. I'm actually thinking that whatever happened, that probably wasn't good. Smashed the muffler. It's one reason why the cylinder cover was a little out of whack. And I think that probably what broke this fin right here. And my guess is that, from what I can tell, the saw maybe got into once, and probably early in its life, based on everything else I see. And it probably compromised some things. Maybe even the cylinder had a leak or something. I really don't know. But at least we've solved the issue that so far I think the cylinder's okay. We haven't gone inside of it and looked closely, but we can get those bolts off without having to take the cylinder. You just got to be careful, and I think part of the problem was one of these bolts. I don't think you can see it really, but it was a little bit bent too. So I just had to get the right angle at it, and then just moving it the right direction was able to slide it right out of that slot. All right, we're going to do some cleanup. All right, we're back, and going to take out the flywheel. We got an OEM flywheel puller here, but unlike my 281 and 282, the threads on the 394 is actually a fine thread, so I'm going to go ahead and just try the fine thread knocker that Husqvarna makes, see if that might pop this flywheel off, and if not, then we will use the flywheel puller tool and see what happens here. Generally, you want to have a hard plastic mallet or a brass mallet, and here we're protecting the threads basically, so this is just going to provide some shock and hopefully free things loose. This flywheel has the key integrated into it as opposed to a separate Woodruff key. So we'll see what happens here, and we're very much hoping we're not going to break that integrated key. Otherwise, either we got to do some machining or we're in for an expensive flywheel. Not loose, so we're going to have to get the puller on. That's what this tool is right here. Just nestles in here. You have to find the locations of the pawl mounting nuts. There we go. And get the correct screws out. You got to be careful with this too. You don't want to over tighten these as you're wrenching down on the tool, because you could quite easily bend these bolts. So what you're doing here is just finding the bolts that are going to thread into the pawl mounting holes. And on this kit, it usually comes with several additional spare nuts or bolts, just in case you damage any of them. I can't remember the actual thread count on it, but it's, I believe, fairly standard, and these are not, you know, high grade bolts or anything like that, so you should be able to actually find them at a hardware store if you were to damage any. So once you've found the appropriate slot, make sure the head of the bolt is wide enough to bridge the slot so it's not going to risk pulling through. And I'm just going to take a straight edge here and tighten these down. Not, you know, they don't have to be aggressive or anything. You're just going to get them a little bit snug. Okay, but you have to have them loose enough initially to get the pulling bolt mounted, and you want to try and center, obviously, this right over the shaft. Let's go ahead and center it and tighten it after we've centered it. And it doesn't have to be right on the money. It can be a few millimeters or thousandths of inch off, not going to matter. Just getting it close enough so that the drive shaft is relatively centered and covered completely by that bolt. Just making sure I got everything mounted here. All right, so we're pretty tight. Now I'm just going to grab a you can do this with a box end wrench as well. I'm just gonna grab my socket since I have them handy. Okay, so we're just gonna start to tighten this. Now, as I said before, you don't want to over tighten this. You can bend the plate, you can bend your bolts. I'm just getting enough pressure on this thing, and then we're gonna knock it just like I did before with that fine thread knocker, but this has got a little more horsepower behind it. Use a mallet like this or a hard plastic, otherwise you're gonna damage potentially the head of your bolt here. And then wrap away. And there you go. It won't take a whole lot. She should just come right off. So that wasn't too bad. Far better than I was expecting. And I don't know if you can see it in there, but there's the integrated key. It's not much of a key, really. I'll have to look closely at that. It's possible that might actually be a separate key that can come out, but it doesn't indicate that on the IPL. So anyway, yeah, it's just another way of giving you a little extra pressure on that before you knock it, and it just works really well. This tool isn't the cheapest in the world, but it is going to come in really handy if you end up, well, if you do your own saw maintenance, then it's important to take these flywheels off from time to time. So having the right tool for the job is really crucial. For some saws, you literally just need to screw on a knocker, and that's all there is to it. For others, these work good, and for yet others, you can actually use a bearing puller if you have enough clearance, or if you can machine the ends of the puller to fit around the flywheel, you can then use a device like that. Other than it's a little hard sometimes to keep those aligned. This kind of guarantees that you're not going to misalign anything. So, all right, a little more cleanup, and then on to the next task. All right. So, it looks like I cleaned up things a little bit here, and it looks like the seal here is actually in pretty good shape. No indication that there was really much blowing out, bypass or leak there under compression. Hard to know for sure under vacuum, but it actually looks pretty good. You know, it's only 4-year-old saw, so the seals easily could last that long. So, you know, maybe this flywheel hadn't been off at all. But anyway, we are going to pull that seal. Incidentally, those are the same seals that you use on 281, 288. I think those seals are used on some other saws, you know, the 394s. I don't know about the 3120s, but at any rate, yeah, so things are still looking okay. A lot more cleanup yet to do, but we're not going to pull that seal just yet. We're going to wait. There is a little bit of corrosion around the crankshaft. Not much, you know, a little bit. Something that can be quite easily cleaned up. I don't see any issues with the threads. You can see the flywheel here cleaned up really nice. The gunk that was on it was actually quite moist, not wet to the eye, but very moist. I'm suspecting that that was actually oil from two-stroke. There's indications of that all over the saw, but it could have been from barn chain oil as well. Some of these saws I've seen, you know, over the years that have been so caked up and dried that, you know, you actually have to scrub on it pretty hard. This just required very little effort on my part using this little nylon brush. And so yeah, if I took some super clean to that, it would probably look pretty much brand spanking new, but she's in real good shape. So that's a good thing. These are not cheap. And I'm a real fan of OEM parts. They just last longer. It's just the bottom line, with exception of maybe some of the add-on things like upgrading different types of dogs. Couple items you can always put on your saw, like aftermarket mufflers that help bring the saw alive, which I think an aftermarket muffler will help immensely on this saw. I'm not going to do a gasket delete. I'm not going to do any porting. I just don't do that stuff. So anyway, till next. All right, so just a little detail here to keep in mind with the 394 or 395. So you can see here that the sealing ring, or the crank seal, whatever you want to call it, is recessed in from this top lip of the crankcase. So we will call that the face of the crankcase. And based upon the 394's manual, that crank seal on the flywheel side is supposed to be 5 millimeters from the end of the crankcase. Now this crankcase may be different. Again, while most of the specs on the 394 service manual may apply to this saw, I don't completely trust that. I don't know if these crank seals have ever been replaced. They don't look like they're leaking. They may have been, or they may not have been. One thing that I like to do is, according to the service manual, the old crank fitting tool for the 281, 288s are the same for fitting the crank. And oftentimes the different recesses here, they're going to match up and be able to seat the sealing rings. So if I slide this end for the flywheel over the flywheel side, it sits just about right. You know, I can't tell for sure. If I go ahead and use a caliper here and try and determine the distance that I'm dealing with, it's about 3.2 or so millimeters. On the 288 and 281, that recess is supposed to be about 3.5, so this is pretty close, not quite. And of course you could use a socket to drive it. I try and use something like this if there's a tool available, because it seats a little more accurately and flush, and I can use the mounting bolt with it to seat it correctly. But let's go ahead and measure this particular saw and see what we're dealing with on the recess. And it takes a little bit of doing because you can't get right up next to the edge of the crank. You're going to be offset a little bit here. 3.79. let's see here. For 3, so I'm getting a little bit of variability here, and that may well be because of the fact that I may not have the right device for this. 3, 3.8. So it does seem as though this seal may not be there. I'm getting 3.8, 3.0. 3.6. So yeah, my method isn't, I'm not getting a perfect level plane here to make this measurement. It looks like it's seated level, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood of 3.5, similar to the 281, 288. It may not be critical in terms of the exact distance there. You have to have it recessed from the top. You probably don't want it too low because you don't want it up against the bearing. So basically what I'm looking at here is somewhere around 3.6, 3.5. That's very close to the recess for the 281 and 282. The 394 shows 5 millimeter. So when I look at the pocket inside the case here after the bearing and the if I take the bearings out and I take the seal out, I should be able to tell whether there was still some space to go there and whether I could go a full 5 millimeter. I'm inclined to believe the 394 specs, but I just don't know. At any rate, so that's a bit of an unknown. The other side of the case, it should be flush with the plane of the case, so I'll show you that a little bit later too. Anyway, you got to pay attention to some of that. If I can find exact specs for the 395, I'll let you know. Otherwise, I'm guessing it's at least a 3.5 millimeter recess from the case plane, possibly as much as 5 millimeters. And when we get into this saw a little more and pull the crank seal next, I'll know whether there's enough room where we could have gone a full 5 millimeter, in which case there's no reason why you couldn't do that, I suppose. Anyway, all for now.